All right, here we're going to skip forward now to Roman numeral 5. That's your V on your checklist if you don't know that one. Body cavities. So with body cavities, let's go ahead and get into our checklist here. And we're going to mark some things to start off with. Where it says letter A, dorsal body cavity, just to the left of there, it's great space right there to work. Write the word major. Okay, this is our first major body cavity. We have two major body cavities we're talking about here. A, dorsal body cavity, as well as B, which is the ventral body cavity. Let's go ahead and talk about the dorsal body cavity to begin with. The dorsal body cavity is going to encompass two portions, both the cranial cavity, which is what is going to house the brain, and the vertebral cavity, which is what's going to house the spinal cord. So if we say, name this major cavity, and we were to point at the brain inside the cranial cavity, or right here, we're looking for major as the dorsal body cavity, encompassing both of them as one. Okay? Think about a lining that surrounds the brain and surrounds the spinal cord. That is the cavity itself intact. Major, again, dorsal body cavity from the skull all the way down the spinal cord. Let's get into our specifics. Name this specific cavity. This specific cavity is called the cranial cavity. It's what's going to be housing the brain, our control center. Versus the vertebral cavity, being specific, houses only the spinal cord. Now to show you a more up-close personal look, we have a skull here. So I can go ahead and stick my fist in here. I'm putting my hand inside of the cranial cavity. That is a specific cavity. To be a specific again as well, we can see the spinal cord here through this horizontal cut, this horizontal plane. And we can see surrounding right through here, this entire space, this is going to what's going to be making up the vertebral cavity, specific. Ventral body cavity will be our next major cavity. So ventral for major. When we're talking about the ventral body cavity, we have to imagine that underneath the chest plate here, we're going to open up to see all the organs intact. That's the key. Everything is intact right now. And we have to imagine there's a thin coating or thin lining that surrounds all these organs and holds them all into place right where they're supposed to be. So one entire, you could almost say a balloon surrounding. Okay, just to imagine. So major, this body cavity is our ventral body cavity. It is a major cavity.
Thoracic.
Thoracic is general, yeah.
Yeah, so
okay.
we go from here.
Yep. So we go from
all
here,
the way down.
Ventral, you ventilate from the anterior portion. Some people breathe with their stomachs, some people breathe with their chests, right? Ventral. Okay. Thoracic cavity, okay, just to be specific, thoracic cavity, we're going to be looking at just this upper portion, okay? Thoracic. Now, to help us divide this or help you imagine, we have a thoracic as a general cavity. That's number one. And if we move down to number 2, under general, okay, we have an abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, if I go ahead and put my hands on both, we have one organ which separates these two general cavities, and that's going to be the respiratory diaphragm. So if we look above the respiratory diaphragm, we have the general cavity, the thoracic cavity. If we move below the diaphragm, we have the general abdominal pelvic cavity. More specific now, okay? We like to be specific, so we're just diving in deep, taking things apart piece by piece, or categorizing them. If we get into a specific cavity, we're going to call this one the pleural cavity. Pleural, I just think two, I don't know why. Plural. Anyway, we have 2 lungs. Each lung, right, in its whole, is going to be surrounded by a cavity called the pleural cavity, okay? It's a thin layer that surrounds each organ, each lung. Now, if we break this apart a little bit more,
Go ahead.
okay.
Yep.
If we break this down a little bit more, nice and easy, you can take a portion of the lung, see the internal portions. Let's go ahead and get it. Oh, I have to take the heart out too. Pardon me, everybody. There we go. We have a lung. We have to imagine that the lung is completely surrounded by what's known as the pleural cavity, a lining. It's a double-layered lining. There's one portion of the lining that is going to be considered tightly attached. And that tightly attached portion, we'd have to actually pick it off the lung, will be called the visceral pleura. That's very specific. Name this specific portion of the cavity. We're looking at the visceral pleura. Now we have to imagine that there's a little bit of fluid inside that space, and then over the top of that, there's another layer that surrounds. That's going to be sitting on, or like I guess you could say lining from the ribs towards the lung. The outermost portion that sits around the lung is going to be called the parietal pleura. Parietal, towards the outside, so parietal pleura. So imagine.
Visceral right there.
There
Visceral right tightly attached to the surface. And go ahead and put your hand up.
And then this other layer just outside, this would be our parietal pleura.
Okay.
Excellent. So there's the lungs. The lungs have a specific pleura called, cavity called the visceral, specific cavity called the parietal, I'm doing this all over again, sorry. It's a cavity called the pleural cavity. Simply enough. Let's go ahead and put the heart back into place. Okay, now if we just look at this specific cavity that surrounds the heart, this is called the pericardial cavity. It also has two portions, right? So if we have the heart only, let me take that out. We have a lining called the pericardial cavity. Now we have a tightly attached portion, tightly attached, remember, pick it away, and that will be called the visceral pericardium. Now imagine we have a layer outside of that, the most outer layer portion, this will be called the parietal pericardium. Now the heart does sit in a little space right here, all right? It does sit in a little space, and this is a space between the pleural cavities. So if we go ahead and imagine, there's the heart, pull it out, we have a space. This space is specifically called the mediastinum. It is a space between the pleural cavities, and what it has in there is the heart, the blood vessels of the heart, the trachea, the esophagus, and we'll also find the thymus gland there too, which I'll show you a little bit later. Now let's go ahead and transition downward. We're going back to our general cavity. From the respiratory diaphragm downward, our general cavity is the abdominal pelvic cavity, and this can be further subdivided into specific portions. Our first specific portion is going to be called the abdominal cavity alone. Subabdominal cavity along the abdomen. Another specific is going to be called the pelvic cavity. So we can find the pelvis. The pelvic cavity is going to be this most inferior portion of the torso.
The biggest thing to remember, folks, is when we are looking at where the separation point is between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavities, there's no true definition on where the division is. The only thing that really matters at that point is what organs are found in those specific body cavities. We do have the diaphragm right here that separates our thoracic body cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, and you will not find a better landmark. But when we start getting down into the abdominal versus the pelvic cavity specifically, what we have to look for is what organs are found in those specific body cavities.
So let's go ahead and tell you which organs you're going to find in that abdominal cavity, that specific abdominal cavity. For instance, we're going to find the liver, the stomach, right? We're going to see portions, we're going to see the small intestines, but portions of the large intestine as well. So let's go ahead and remove some of these structures here. As I said, whoop, there goes a kidney. But hey, stomach.
Oh, show the stomach again, Colin.
Stomach. And we might as well look at the back of the stomach. We're going to show you that organ in a little bit here. We have the liver. Pull that out. Might break some stuff. We have some blood vessels here, right? So we're looking at the ascending aorta, for instance. But then we have the small intestines, the large intestines as well.
We need those out.
Oh, so yeah, you're right. I'm not going to leave them out. Now for the pelvic cavity, this is perfect. Another specific cavity. With the pelvic cavity, we're going to see several organs, again, lower in the more inferior portion. We're going to see things like the urinary bladder. We're going to see things like the reproductive organs. So this is, with this being a female model, right? We have ovaries. We have, again, the bladder. So we're looking at urinary system. And yeah, that's pretty much it for that portion. Let's go ahead and get back into the abdominal cavity again. So we're going back to this upper portion where we had these, small and large intestines sitting at the lower portion of that. All right. We're going to go ahead and name these two portions of that cavity. So if we're naming portions, just like we did with the heart, it had a pericardial cavity, surrounds the heart. there is a abdominal cavity, okay, with the abdominal cavity as portions. It's first off called the peritoneal cavity, and then what we're going to do is break that down. We have the tightly attached portion. The tightly attached portion is going to be called the visceral peritoneum. Now, if we have an outer layer from there, we're calling that the parietal peritoneum. We do have some more stray organs, though, that sit outside, and that term is going to be called retroperitoneal. Retroperitoneal organs are foreign, to be very specific. So, yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. It's just the
camera
magnets are strong here, and we lost one of them. Perfect. And we can imagine the stomach sits here too, okay? Even though it's not going to hold in place, we get the idea. So we have retroperitoneal organs, organs that lie outside of the body cavities. If we find the stomach, that is our landmark to go behind or posterior to. And just posterior to the stomach sits this elongated organ called the pancreas. Pancreas is one of the four. Another pair are our kidneys. We have their little top hats, I like to say sometimes, but we call these adrenal glands. And then last but not least, we have this little blood reservoir called the spleen. Awesome. So there's all four retroperitoneal.